Companion planting seems to be something that a lot of growers and gardeners are interested in, or at least they're interested in the idea. But as with many ideas in the vegetable gardens, there seems to be a lot less actual experience. One of the most common examples of companion planting, intercropping, or a guild that people reference is the Three Sisters, which is an integrated planting of maize or corn together with squash and beans, which was developed and used by some indigenous peoples of North America. I have been interested in the Three Sisters for many years, but I didn't try growing it, mainly because I didn't think they would be successful in the cool climate that we have here in Ireland. But this past year I decided to finally try it out with a large planting to fill the older polytunnel that I use, as well as a planting in the area outside of this polytunnel. Although we did get some crops, I think there are a number of issues that would need to be sorted out before this Three Sisters approach to companion planting would be really worth growing in this context. The Three Sisters is commonly described as clusters of a few corn or maize plants, with beans sown at the base so that they're able to climb up the corn stalks. And then squash is planted in the space between these clusters, and these large plants with large leaves would spread out to fill the full space, sheltering the soil from the sun, reducing evaporation, and shading out the weeds. So the corn or maize plants would provide the structure or support for the beans, and they would also serve as a windbreak for the squash plants below. And originally it was grown to produce a dried flint corn. The bean plants would fix nitrogen in the roots, most of which would end up in the protein of the dried beans, and the rest remaining in the soil to be absorbed by the other plants. All three of these crops could be relatively easy to manage once they were established, and they could all be harvested at the same time in the autumn, providing a storable supply of food for many months for the squash and possibly many years for the maize and beans. Or at least that is what is commonly known about the Three Sisters, and it all sounds great. But of course there are nuances and details that are not necessarily communicated, especially what type of climate this type of planting would be suitable for. I was not convinced that this was an appropriate strategy for the cool maritime climate that we have, but in the polytunnels, this trio of crops could be more successful. This past season, I wanted to take a break from growing more labor-intensive crops in my older polytunnel. So I decided to take the opportunity of growing the Three Sisters in the full space of this protected microclimate. And I thought it would be interesting to see how well these plants would produce outside, so I also planted the Three Sisters in the space beside this polytunnel. Having a planting like this, both inside and outside, provided an interesting opportunity to compare, and to hopefully figure out how to adapt both plantings to be more successful, and there were definite issues that I would want to address. We planted sweetcorn instead of the traditional flint or dried corn because ears of fresh sweetcorn is one of the main crops that I want to produce. It's also very difficult to get seeds for varieties of dried flint corn or maize here in Ireland. And I planted a hybrid variety of sweet corn that had apparently been bred to be quite a bit shorter so that it could fit within the relatively low space of the polytunnel. The sweet corn was planted before the beans, as is typically recommended, and these plants grew well. But the bean plants quickly caught up and eventually overshadowed the sweet corn plants more than I would have expected. And a few of the sweet corn plants bent and fell over under the weight of the developing beans, even though there wasn't any wind in the polytunnel to blow them over. The varieties of maize that would have been traditionally used were apparently much stronger and taller plants, which would have been able to support the weight of the beans a lot better. But I would have needed a much taller polytunnel or greenhouse for plants that tall. We also planted an open pollinated sweet corn variety outside, selecting an early maturing variety to increase the chance of actually getting a crop. And these plants were also quite short, but it didn't really matter as the bean plants hardly grew at all outside. But if they had grown a lot better, I suspect they would have caused the sweet corn plants to be blown over in the wind. It seems that many modern varieties of sweet corn have been bred to be smaller, with the energy of the plant focused on the sweetness of the kernels, not the strength of the stalk. This is great for a monocrop of sweet corn, but most varieties are probably not tall enough or strong enough to serve as the main structural element within this Three Sisters planting. We sowed 7 different varieties of climbing beans, but only one of them, the Borlato variety, was typically used for producing a seed, with all the rest of them bred for producing tender pods. I wanted to take the opportunity to see how well these 7 varieties would be able to produce dried seed, and this made the crop much easier to manage without the frequent search for fresh pods to harvest. Some of these varieties were more successful than others in the polytunnel, especially the Borlato variety. But the plants were too vigorous for the height of the space, and some of the plants produced too many pods for the sweetcorn to be able to support. And some of the bean varieties were probably planted too late, with many pods failing to ripen. But at least the Borlato pods matured much earlier, producing a great batch of dried seed, and it seems that variety selection is really important with this type of planting for producing seed. We planted the same set of 7 varieties outside, but none of them grew very well, and only a few vines managed to make it to the top of the shorter sweetcorn plants, and I ended up abandoning the entire crop as so few pods were produced. I will need to either find varieties of beans that will grow better in these cool conditions, or figure out a way of growing these beans earlier in the season. But an earlier crop may be at risk from frost, and it may be too early for the sweetcorn plants to grow fast enough for the beans to be able to use as a support. Getting the right variety is also an important issue for the squash understory of this trio, or in this case, there were too many varieties and they were too different in the way they grew. I had decided to take the opportunity of continuing with the trial of lots of different squash and pumpkin varieties in the polytunnel and outside, and this complicated things. Some of the squash varieties were way too vigorous in the polytunnel and seemed to take over most of the space. And a lot of their vines grew up into the sweet corn and climbing beans, causing overshadowing and adding additional weight to the already overcrowded stalks. I ended up having to cut and remove quite a few vines to lighten the load and open up the space, and this is something that I probably should have started earlier in the season. Other pumpkin and squash varieties were much less vigorous and were overshadowed by their much more aggressive neighbors, or never grew well enough to produce much. And outside, where we planted a smaller selection of these varieties, some of them produced reasonably well, but most of them didn't produce enough worth harvesting. And there were lots of spaces where the coverage of the squash leaves was not enough to suppress the weeds, and we ended up with quite a weedy patch of ground at the end of the season. So variety selection is also key with the squash, and I'd want to select varieties that would produce well either inside or outside, and I'd want to adjust the plant spacing to accommodate the vigor of the plants that we did grow. The density of the plants was an issue, or perhaps the ratio of the number of plants of each of the 3 sisters needed adjusting. In the polytunnel, we grew 72 sweetcorn plants in 18 clusters of 4 plants each, spaced down the middle 2 beds of the polytunnel where the space was higher. We thinned the bean seedlings to 3 plants in the middle of each sweetcorn cluster. And we sowed extra beans in the space between these clusters so that they could grow up twines supported from the polytunnel structure. So there was about 80 beans in total, which was too much, with the bean plants filling up a lot of the space, and the extra planting of beans was probably a bad idea. There were 30 squash and pumpkin plants transplanted into the 2 side beds, and if all of these varieties were relatively small growing, then this number of plants probably would have worked out quite well. But with quite a few more vigorous vining varieties including in the mix, with some vines measuring more than 9 meters long, everything was too crowded. So the 72 sweet corn, 80 beans, and 30 squash ended up being too many plants for the 100 square meter space. If I was to grow this type of planting in this polytunnel again, I think I would keep a similar spacing and number of sweet corn plants, but probably grow half as many bean and squash plants. This would be closer to the ratio of 4 sweet corn plants to 2 bean plants to 1 squash plant, which is closer to the ratio that we planted outside. But so much would depend on the success and vigor of the varieties that we used. Another issue was the amount of fertility that was available, as the soil in the beds of the polytunnel was already quite fertile, which allowed the plants to grow quite vigorously. I didn't check to see how many nitrogen-fixing nodules were on the roots of the bean plants, and it is possible with such fertile soil that not much extra nitrogen would have been produced by the beans. Because the polytunnels are such high-value growing spaces, I tend to incorporate a lot of compost and other concentrated fertility to be able to make the most of these spaces. But this means that the potential nitrogen-fixing benefit from growing the beans isn't that important. In the outside planting, the beans grew so poorly that there would not have been much nitrogen fixed at all, even though the ground in this patch would definitely use more fertility. I had transplanted the squash over pits of partially decomposed compost and added additional concentrated amendments, but I don't think this was enough for the really hungry squash and sweet corn plants. In order for the beans to add a useful amount of nitrogen into the mix, I would have to use varieties that grew really vigorously in this climate. The climbing beans have flowers that don't require pollination by bees or other insects, which work quite well within the enclosed space of the polytunnel. The squash flowers do need pollination, and there were some very active bumblebees visiting the flowers in the polytunnel. But I suspect that quite a few of the female flowers remained unpollinated, and this is probably the key reason why there were fewer numbers of squash than I had expected. Outside, pollination wasn't really an issue for the squash plants, and I think it was the cooler temperatures and lower levels of fertility that prevented more squash from developing. With the wind-pollinated sweet corn, most of the ears in the polytunnel were full of kernels, which means that enough of the pollen that was released from the tassels at the top of the plant had ended up landing on the silks as it drifted through the relatively still air. But it was different outside, as the general breezy conditions seemed to blow a lot of the pollen away. And with the clusters of sweet corn plants spaced farther apart, the wind-blown pollen seemed to miss a lot of the silks, so the ears were not adequately pollinated and there were a lot of gaps between the kernels on the cob. I think this kind of planting is much better when there is a much bigger field planted with corn, so there is a lot more pollen blowing around. But in smaller spaces with fewer sweet corn plants spaced farther apart to make room for the squash plants, the risk of poor pollination seems to increase quite a bit, especially on windy sites. In total, we were able to harvest about 60 ears of sweet corn from this polytunnel, weighing about 20 kilograms as full ears, but less if we count just the corn on the cob. And we harvested a bit more than 5 kilograms of dried beans and about 240 kilograms of squash, though not all of them were ripe. More could be harvested if we had grown better varieties, but a yield of about 265 kilograms from the 100 square meter growing space is low, especially as we could produce more than 600 kilograms in the same space with other crops. But this intercropping of the Three Sisters was not designed to be a high-yielding intensive planting. And it's probably more appropriate as an easy-to-manage field-scale crop where significantly lower yields are acceptable. I question whether it is worth growing the Three Sisters in the higher value and limited space of a polytunnel unless I could get significantly higher yields or had a lot more polytunnel space than I could make use of. The planting outside produced a really poor crop with barely any beans, ears of sweet corn with missing kernels, and a lot of the squash didn't ripen enough. I would need to find ways to improve the harvest from all three of these crops in this climate for it to be worth growing the Three Sisters outside again. These two plantings of the Three Sisters was a very useful exploration, even if the yield was disappointing, as I learned a lot. I would want to change quite a bit if I ever grew this intercropping trio outside again. I would need to find a much hardier variety of climbing beans that produce good quality dried seed, and I'd want to find varieties of squash that were much more productive in this climate. I would probably plant even more sweet corn plants in the same space in order to improve pollination, but this would reduce the space available for the squash and possibly overshadow them too much. And I would want to improve the fertility of the soil quite a bit more before planting. In the polytunnel, I think there would be more of a focus on the squash and the sweet corn with fewer beans. I think the sweet corn would probably do better without being so crowded by the beans, and the success of the squash is probably more related to the variety selection, the spacing, and hoping for adequate pollination. The sweet corn and the squash would also be much higher value than the dried beans in this context. And the potential nitrogen fixing benefit of the beans is not so important in this garden with really well-developed soil. But if I grew the beans mostly for harvesting their fresh, tender pods, this would increase their value and desirability, as well as increasing the amount of time that I would spend searching for the pods within the crowded polytunnel. Overall, I'm still not sure if it is worth growing the Three Sisters in a climate like Ireland, except as an interesting experiment. None of the crops do very well outside in this type of planting, and the protected space of the polytunnel is probably more valuable for other crops. I still want to grow all three of these crops, but probably in segregated or separate beds, where I'm more likely to be able to give the plants what they need. The potential benefits of this companion planting or intercropping seem to have ended up as limitations in this context. The Three Sisters planting is probably much better in the hotter climates and in the larger, less intensively cultivated spaces in which it was developed. I think trials like this are really interesting, and it's great to have the spare capacity to be able to dedicate this amount of space to an experiment that is likely to fail, or at least not produce very much. And I can only do this because of people like you watching and engaging with the videos I make, and with the people who are supporting my work and this Red Gardens project through Patreon and PayPal. If you find value in the work that I do and like the videos that I make and have your own spare capacity, please consider joining them. The links are in the video description. But most importantly, thank you for watching.